My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive at Hamilton College. Very happy to have Dawoud Sabu Adeyola with me this morning. And welcome, sir.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. I'm going to introduce you as a bassist, composer, jazz educator, and a well-known figure in Buffalo and beyond.
Yeah, that's a fair description.
All
Thank
right.
you. Yeah.
I used to live in Buffalo myself for a while, and would go down to the Trofamador, down those stairs, and I was thinking this
Oh,
morning, did the music scene, the jazz scene, which I know a lot of jazz musicians pass through Buffalo, did it make an impression on you when you were in your teenage years?
without doubt. Yeah. When I grew up here in Buffalo, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I think it's very important. As you know, I'm a bit of a historian myself. I've written at least one book uh, about the history of the Colored Musicians Club here in Buffalo and its parent, uh, Local 533. And there's a new edition that should be forthcoming soon, which is kind of updating, and got a little bit more research materials in it. Yeah, but no, yeah. When I grew up in Buffalo, I'm born and raised in Buffalo, and yeah, we had quite a scene here in Buffalo. A lot of clubs, a lot of venues. When I was in high school, I started visiting the local clubs such as the Pine Grill and the Reveillot and the Bonton. And my very first jazz concert ever that I went to was at Kleinhans Music Hall, which was a Cannonball Adderley sextet with Nancy Wilson. I
Oh
think I was
no,
I think I was a I
you
think
just
I
said
was
the
a fre
magic words.
I think I was a freshman in high school, so yeah.
People who know me know that my favorite LP is Nancy Wilson and Cannonball Adderley.
Oh, that's a great album. They had just made that album for Capitol Records when they came to Kleinhans, and it was a double bill because George Shearing was on the first half, and then Cannonball's quintet was on the second. And with Cannonball, his brother Nat, Yusef Lateef, Joe Zawinul, uh, one of my very favorite mentors, Sam Jones on bass, and Louis Hayes on drums. So I had a good you know uh, that was like my coming out party. That's the first jazz concert I ever went to.
Were you playing the bass at the time?
I was not at that time. I was a piano student.
Well,
I was yeah.
it begs the question, what made you switch to the most important instrument in any combo?
Um, Couple things. For one, uh, I had a companion, a growing up buddy, Junie Booth, which you probably know about Mr. Booth. Uh, he lived a couple blocks away from me, and we were both, you know, uh, playing piano. I was taking formal lessons at the Wurlitzer School of Music, and he was kind of self-taught and also studying with one of Buffalo's local heroes, legends, Billy Galt, pianist. I don't know if you know about Billy Galt, but he recorded with Jackie McLean and was on the staff there at the school in Hartford for a while. I think he still lives in Hartford. Well, Billy Galt, but he was quite a mentor to a lot of musicians, including Junie and myself. Anyway, Junie and I used to, Junie didn't have a piano, and so I did. So we'd be over my house. We used to go through the neighborhood, going wherever we could find a piano, we'd go there and we'd just, you know, try to play and cut each other up on the piano. So we wound up in the same high school, East High School. And I had been thinking about the bass, especially, since I met Sam Jones. And the bass was kind of fascinating to me. Had my eye on it. And one day I decided to go to the music room in high school and just ask about the bass. And the music director, the band director told me, "Oh man, you're one day too late because Junie Booth just came and got the last bass."
He cut you.
He did. I said, man, this guy, because he was always a step ahead of me on piano. He was real smart, really, a real genius kid. And I said, man, he did it again. So I put the bass out of my mind until I wound up in Germany. in 1965. I was sent to Germany as in the Air Force, but I had 3 years to do. And I'm wondering, I said, what am I going to do with this 3 years? It's not going to make it just a big hole and a gap in my life, you know? And so I thought about, I said, I'm in the land of the violin. Maybe I can find a bass over here, you know? So I did, you know, I went around, I started looking around and that's a whole nother long story, but I happened upon a wonderful bassist who was the principal bassist in the Würzburg Symphony. You know, he was a soloist, you know, and he was very happy to have me as a student, and that's how I got started in bass.
Were you playing the piano you were playing at the time? Was it classical music, or were you learning chords and trying to copy jazz pianists?
I was, you know, I was taking classical lessons. You know, like I said, my mother started me at the Wurlitzer School of Music downtown Buffalo when I was about 8, and they had a deal going that if you bought a new piano, you got a year or two of free lessons that went with the piano. So me and my big sister, we both availed ourselves, and we'd go for lessons. And then after that ran out, then my mother uh, hired a piano teacher who came by the house, you know. And so we were doing all the regular, you know, from piano primer books and whatnot. But I always had my ear on, you know, what was going on at the time, the doo-wop, you know, the soul. And when I got in high school, I got, you know, my jazz ear got open. And so I had a few, there were a few pianists that I thought I could copy, like Horace Silver and Bobby Timmons, the blues-oriented guys, you know. So I started teaching myself how to do that. And so I was kind of doing both at the same time.
Mhm. I just
But
was reading a
yeah,
book about early rock and roll and the Chitlin circuit and how popular guys like Roy Brown um, were at the time in the mid 50s. I'm wondering if that music, which was we used to think of it as pre-rock and roll or R&B, did was that something you listened to? And also, I wonder, what did your parents like having played in the house? What kind of music?
um, well, first of all, you know, people ask me what drew me to the bass, and I tell them, like, you know, I used to stand. My father was sang bass in the choir in the church, and as a little guy, I used to stand next to him while he's rolling out these luscious bass notes, you know, in the choir. And so uh, the church is full of family members who were involved in music. My aunt played the organ, directed the choir. I had another uncle who was a baritone soloist. He used to do solo concerts. And my cousins, you know, they all played. And so we just had a rich musical. My mother even played. My mother played. She said during the whole 9 months she was carrying me, she was playing in her mother's church. Her mother was an evangelist, and so she was playing and directing the choir. And she was wishing that I might be a musician. You know, later on when I started traveling the globe as a musician, she said, you have to be careful what you pray for. You
With your
because
what?
what you be careful what you ask for, what you
Yes.
pray for, you know, because it may come back to haunt you, you know, because I was never home, you know. But no, yeah, we were very much affected. And see, the other thing about those days is that there was only a couple radio stations, and you know, you had race record stores, and you had what they call race records. Radio stations, and so we were all in the '50s, pretty much listening to the same music. You know, the popular music at the time. You know, we knew as much about the black R&B artists as we did about the white ones. You know, because you get a little bit of both. You know, on you know, they'd mix it up a lot. You know, Benny and the Jets and James Brown and the Cadillacs and all these old people. So we grew up on doo-wop basically, you
Yeah.
know, which is basically a various forms of the blues. And so I guess we started out imitating those sounds and those chords on the piano, which is a lot of repetition. So we kind of taught ourselves how to. Nobody ever really taught us how to do that. We kind of figured it out.
Did you get the impression once you started playing the bass, I'm going to guess that your listening habits started centering in more on that part of the music. And did
Yes,
you start to learn patterns and hearing them before you could even went to play them?
yes, yeah, absolutely. I had when I was in Germany, when I first started in Germany, I had a bunch of records. Um, we had a what they call a BX or base exchange, uh, that had a lot of records. It had a nice record selection, and so I wound up with a couple hundred albums in my room in the barracks. And I was, another early um experience that affected my whole life was New Year's Eve, 1963. I was going into well, actually, I was in the middle of my senior year because I graduated in June of '64. So no, yeah, my junior year. It was 63 was coming in, and Miles Davis came to the Miles Davis Quintet came to downtown Buffalo. I think it was the Town Casino. Um, and I had been listening to the records, those records he made on Prestige before he got to Columbia. I mean, he made a bunch of records just to get out of the contract. Relaxing with the Miles Davis Quartet, working with the Miles Davis Quartet, cooking with the Miles Davis Quartet, and even even beyond, even before that, when he was making records with Bird and Birth of the Cool, I had all those things. But I was really into the, what they call hard bop, with, those groups that had John Coltrane, Paul Chambers, Ray Garland. So anyway, when I heard he was coming to the Town Casino, of course I showed up, and uh, but I was disappointed when I got there because I was looking for Paul Chambers and Wynton Kelly or Red Garland and you know maybe Coltrane or somebody like that. He shows in with these new guys, that I had never heard of before. These young guys, Tony Williams, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock,
He couldn't get
and George
anybody good, huh?
and George Coleman. I'm like, oh man, Miles, come on, man, what are you doing, man? Who are these guys? I don't know. We don't know these guys. Not realizing that this is the group that's going to be called the second great quintet. you know. And so that's what I remember about that concert. I was really, you know, disappointed at first, but then when I heard him, I said, "Well, yeah, this might," and it was brand new. They just put that group together. I heard him. I said, yeah, this might be okay. And uh, and the other thing I remember about that concert is uh, how small the audience was. I was like, "Where's everybody?" I mean, what? This is Miles Davis. I mean, even a kid of 16, in those days, and I'm saying, man, this place is supposed to be packed. But at least the night I went, I think they had about 2 or 3 nights, and the night I went, uh, there was almost no one there. So,
Do you recall beyond the music, noticing how they operate on stage, visual cues, um, just watching the bass player interact with the drummer? Was any of that apparent to you?
oh yeah, yeah, I was very, especially, I mean, at the first concert, I mean, with the Cannonball thing and George Shearing, client hands, I'm sitting way in the back, and I couldn't really, focus in on the interactions and whatnot. But at the Tower Casino, I'm sitting right almost underneath them, and I could see. And then, of course, everybody had an eye on Miles because he had a reputation for, uh, doing different stuff, turning his back or leaving the stage, and that kind of stuff. And so I'm really watching him. And this time I had no idea about music as a profession or bass or not anything like that. I'm just really uh, somebody who had fell in love with the music and was kind of trying to follow it. But they were definitely communicating with each other. but again, not to the extent that they got to later on, I mean, because I think that I think he announced that this group was brand new, only not even 6 months old.
Hmm.
And so they were still kind of feeling each other out and learning to play with each other. And I think that was in the time when Tony, they had to paint a mustache on him to try to get him in because he was
What's
he
the
was
thing?
he was underage.
He wasn't that much older than you at the time, was he?
1 year,
1 year.
1 year. I think he's born in 46 and I was born in 47.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you got paid to play your bass?
Yes, yes, I do. It was from a man named Elvin Shepherd. You know about Elvin Shepherd?
I see his name on your promo material.
Elvin Shepherd was a great musician. He was Grover Washington's teacher. And when Grover would ever, if you see any interviews about Grover Washington, they ask him about it, like you asked me about my background. He always goes on and on and on about how great Elvin Shepherd was. And Elvin Shepherd was a member of the local 533, the Black Musicians Union, which is a whole nother story. I was so blessed to be a part of that. I joined that union 6 months before it was dissolved. I mean, the union, the white union and the black union were merged by mandate. It was mandated. The merger, there were about almost 20 cities in Buffalo that had segregated unions, and in 1953 they started merging. Uh, and Los Angeles was the first one. Benny Carter was a big part of that. Benny Carter, because of his statures, I mean, he's the king. And he got involved with the union. I mean, you had to be in the union, and then he was being in L.A. with all the entertainment, movies and stuff. And he said he was even they were saying, man, this is crazy. Why should we have two unions? I mean, the black union and the white union, this is crazy. So he led the move to integrate the unions out there. And in 53 and 54, that was the first one. Gradually, they all started merging, especially after the Civil Rights Act of 65, which said that, segregation is illegal. Buffalo was the very last one to do it. you know,
Oh, did you notice positive or negative circumstances that followed that merging of the union?
I saw both actually. I mean, in the long run, it was good because segregation in any form, based on, race, gender, religion, is always, I mean, even as a kid, I was raised in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and I used to wonder why, you know, I mean, it was segregated. I mean, it wasn't, what I mean, if a white person came to serve to worship and sat down, people would wonder, oh, who's that? What's he doing here? You know what I mean? He's in the 50s, up north in Buffalo. And so we had this as Malcolm X said one time, he said the most segregated time in America is 12 o'clock on Sundays, when that, yeah. So anyway, how did I go there? You were asking about the after
Yep,
effect.
the
Yeah,
union, yeah.
in the long run, it was positive because it broke down this law that was actually federal. It was sanctioned. Just like segregation and even slavery was sanctioned by the government, by the Constitution, and this thing went on into labor unions. So in that sense, it was good that it was no longer the law of the land. It was actually illegal. But in terms of the actual uh, impact on the ground, black musicians suffered, because even though the union was formed out of because they were refused admittance into the white union at the local 43 at the time, and so it was formed out of necessity because if you wanted to work, you had to have a union card. And so one of the guys, one of the white musicians came over and he was against it. He didn't agree with it. And he sat down with some of the black. He said, listen, you guys, if they won't let you join, you probably should form your own union. And he knew how to do it, you know. And so he helped form Local 533, which he told him you have to form it. At that time, there were two kind of black unions. One was called a subsidiary union, which was under the control and under the supervision of the white union. They had almost no authority. They had a union, but to do anything, they had to go over there to the office over there. And when they had the national conventions, they weren't invited. They couldn't vote. You know what I mean? But then you had independent autonomous unions, which this guy said you got to get that autonomous part. You guys will be autonomous. You got to vote. You're a legitimate union just like any other. So that's what for Local 533 was. And but they had developed a lot of things that even 43 didn't have. They had a credit union. They had death benefits. You know, they had. I mean, a credit union. I mean, that's a bank. I mean, they set this up way back in. This is back in the 20s and the 30s. They were pretty smart.
Yeah.
They had a bank account that was about triple the size of the other one, you know. And so, and they had a building, right, which still, as you know, is there. So they lost everything pretty much in the merger because the larger union kind of swallows up the assets of the smaller one. They lost everything but the building. And the reason they didn't lose the building is because it was incorporated away from the union. It has its own incorporation status.
I see. That's a great
And
story.
it was a great thing. They was because they said, listen, this segregation thing is not going to last. And when they merge, the other union is going to come in, they're going to swallow up all your assets, including your real estate. And so when it came, the president of the old union, he actually came over and asked for the key, because yeah, he said, well, we'll take the key, we'll take the building now. So the president, his name was Perry Gray. He was a shrewd guy, He said, you want the key? Okay, I tell you what, come upstairs, buy you a drink, So they're sitting there, what are you having? So he give him what he wants, So they're sitting there drinking and said, now, about this key, look up over the bar there. You see that certificate of incorporation? Colored Musicians Club Incorporated. It has nothing to do with the union. Sorry, sir, no key.
Enjoy your drink.
Enjoy. You're right. So that's a story. The old guys love to tell that story. Yeah, man, that guy actually came over here and asked for the key. Can you imagine that? But yeah.
I want to go back to your first gig because I want to see if you made as much as I did on my first gig.
$25.
Ooh,
yeah.
Not bad for the first gig.
What'd you make
back then?
What'd you make?
I made 4.
Whoa. What year was that? Well, no. You know what? I'll take it back. I take it. That wasn't the first time I got paid. The first time I got paid was when I was in high school when I was still playing piano. You heard of Joe Ford, right?
Yeah.
Saxophone. Yeah. Okay. Joe Ford is another one. He and I had our very first gigs together. And he was playing saxophone then. It was a trio. It was saxophone, piano, and conga. And conga, the conga player, his name was Reggie McCullough. He was the leader of the band. He organized this whole thing. And it was at the YMCA, and it was a dance. and people were actually dancing, And I think we made about $10 or $12 a piece on that gig. So yeah.
That's a lot of pressure on the piano player with no bass and carrying the
rhythm. So I must have been doing something okay, So we had a couple little gigs like that.
Let me jump ahead a little bit. When I look at your list of people that you've collaborated with,
mm-hmm.
You're going everywhere from Big Joe Turner to Ahmad Jamal to Dexter Gordon and on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to form a question about, from a bass player standpoint, do you feel you adjust your playing to the circumstance? I mean, it almost sounds like, well, of course, yes, but people write about, like Miles is quoted as saying that Ahmad Jamal taught him about using space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you play with these variety of musicians, how do you pick up on what you should be doing?
Well, the first thing, like I tell my students in the university, the first thing you have to do as a bassist or a rhythm section player, I think it's true, chord players, pianists, guitarists, drummers, but especially the bass player. You have to be really a good listener, you know. Uh, you have to be, and then you have to have, you have to have a repertoire. I mean, you have to know a lot of songs, a lot of tunes, a lot of patterns. I was fortunate when I first started playing around Buffalo. There was a piano player named J-Man, Jimmy Manuel. I was a part of his trio, and he had his repertoire book was like that huge. You know what I mean?
Mm.
He passed on now. I've got a mind. I should have done it, but I have a mind to call his widow and ask her what happened to that book he had, man, because he had a bunch of tunes in there. And so he would try to play all those tunes. And he had charts. So I learned a lot of standards and at that time bossa nova was kind of getting big, so he was on top of that. He had a lot of those songs from Carl Jobim and whatnot. So that's the first thing, is to be familiar with the literature of music. And second thing, you have to really listen because everybody's different. As you mentioned, and Miles observed, Ahmed, at the beginning, he was known for using space, but when I got with him, he was filling up those spaces more, and he was playing. He was like really, and so I mean, he was really. Some of the critics said that they attributed that maybe I had a little influence on him because I was kind of a heavier, I had like a heavier touch. And but if you listen to those, like what we did in France with Gary Burton, you know, is really the way he played Mahatma the Carnival, and all those songs. I mean, it's really hot, it's really loud. And with Peyton Crosby on drums, who Peyton Crosby and Tony Williams had the same teacher in Boston, Alan Dawson. Uh, and Roy Haynes is from Boston too. So a certain thing about those Boston drummers that they brought with them to New York. But yeah, no, you that's a long answer, but basically you have to be a really good listener because everybody plays differently. I play, for instance, when I played with Joe Turner, if I remember correctly, he's known as a blues player, right? He did blues all night, and everything was in the key of C, you know, everything. And he brought his own piano player, but it didn't sound like it. It was all different, it was similar, same thing with Mose. On the other hand, Mose Allison was known as a blues guy, but he played very little traditional. I mean, it always had the blues feeling, a heavy blues feeling, which really was remarkable, especially for a white musician. You're from, I think he's from Mississippi or somewhere like that. But he had this real nice, and he was an excellent pianist too, excellent. All of his music, it had chord changes. It had charts. So when you listen to it, it sounded, oh yeah, he's playing his blues. But there are always different chord changes in it. So you got to. So that's the third thing. The first thing is you got to know a lot. You have to be familiar with the literature, and you have to be able to listen. Then you also have to be able to read music because a lot of times these guys that come in, there's not very little rehearsal. Like with Dexter, we had one rehearsal, and at that time he had done that recording with Donald Byrd. What's the name of it? It was a Donald Byrd composition. I can't think of the name of it. Uh, but anyway, it's a little different. The form is really different. And so he said, yeah, sometimes people ask for this. So we tried it a little bit. At that time, Virgil Day was a drummer and John Weiss was a piano player. And we looked at it a little bit and Dexter said, oh, no, it's too hard. We won't do it. So in the middle of the set, we were at the 12th downstairs that you mentioned. In the middle of the set, Donald Byrd had been playing in town. Uh, I think he did a concert at one of the universities upstate. So he walks into the club. Here at Dexter's Day, he walks into the club. So people see him. and they immediately started requesting this song that we decided we that we were going. And Dexter says he had this deep voice. Hey, yeah, the people they want us to play Donald soon. What do you think? I said, well, yeah, we'll follow you, man. So it came out all right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was
one
gonna
flight up, one flight up, one
flight
flight
up.
up.
That's
Yeah,
right.
remember that? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a strange form to it. It's a long form to it.
Did any of these artists ever tell you to stop doing something or to, suggest that why don't you play this this way? Give you some instruction.
The only one was I think was Ahmad because he didn't do it that much. He had a different way of he didn't play songs the way other people did. He always altered the changes. He always uh you know used substitutions, and his substitutions were his own. And so you had to learn that from him. He had to learn them. In fact, a lot of times I would hear him. Sometimes if I didn't, he would. And see, he didn't do a lot of verbalization in terms of do this, do that. He would just, if he wanted a certain note in the bass, he would just hit it. He would do bang, 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 bang. I said, okay, you got it. And then that went into your permanent memory because, like I said, we rehearsed a lot, but we didn't do a lot. We didn't do a lot of rehearsing. So having an intuition for it and being flexible. Um, I remember one time I was working with Abby Lincoln at the Village Vanguard, and we already had been playing around. The band sounded pretty good, but on the first set of the Village Vanguard, uh, we would. She felt like anyway, like the band was a little tight, it was a little edgy. So she turns around after the first or two songs, and she says, and the people could hear it too because the mic was on. She says, "Listen, don't worry because this is the Vanguard. This is the easiest place to play in the world. The people love us. Just relax and play." And after that, the night, and I always remember that. She said, "No, don't worry, we're cool." And I think that was my favorite job, working with that lady. I call her the Golden Lady. Yeah.
The golden lady. I have a
Yeah.
quote here from Mr. Al Tinney,
Hmm.
and I got
Man.
to interview him back in 2002, and he was
Hmm.
talking about a trio that they were playing at a club called Fanny's, I guess.
Yes.
And he described how you guys worked together, and he said, and then his quote was, "Well, it didn't take us long to do this because I have two exceptionally fine musicians. The drummer is Louis Marino, and the bass player is Sabu Adeyola. He's wanted all over town by the right people."
He's so kind. He's he's my second father, you know. Yeah, you know what? He actually told my father that. He says because I used to, both my parents were alive at the time. And sometimes I'd take him by the house, because they loved him too. Actually, Fanny's was right around the corner from where my parents used to live. And so one time we're sitting there at the kitchen table having coffee, and he tells my dad, he says, "Oh, by the way, I've adopted your son, but is that all right? Is that okay with you?" He said, "I've adopted him, as a son, yeah, because they were around the same age. I mean, my father was born in 1920, and Al was born in 1921, and so he says, "Is that all right, Mr. Lewis?" And he said, "Oh yeah, no, sure, man, no problem, man." So that's how close we were.
That's
I really,
great.
yeah,
What a feeling that was to talk to someone who had been in the original production of, with George Gershwin of Porgy and Bess.
yeah.
Like that just really blew my mind.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean that's cool. But to me, his association with Charlie Parker, man, that Bird actually mentioned him, in a couple books, like Ross Russell's Bird Lives, where Bird actually says that the reason that he uh stayed when he visited New York with Jay McShann back in the early 40s, and he decided to stay in New York because he went to a jam session at Monroe's, and he heard a new form of music being played under the leadership of a pianist named Alan Tinney, and that made him want to stay in New York and learn more about this music. I'm like, wow, that's that's some shit there, man. Wow, Bird said that. So, and see, we didn't know when we started the Buffalo Jazz Ensemble in 1975. Um, I knew Al, but I didn't know all that about him. So somebody came in, you know, to a rehearsal one day because we used to rehearse 4 or 5 days a week. We were like on the city payroll, did concerts all over town. Somebody came in and said, "Al, your name's in this book, this Charlie Parker book, and Bird's talking about you, man. Talking about how great you were and how he learned from you." And people say, "Oh, no way, man." And the guy brought the book and said, "Look, there's your man." So everybody was kind of really, uh, so somebody was saying, one of the young guys was saying, "Oh man, that's history. That's in the past." And somebody else said, "No, no, 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 man. Bebop is forever. Bebop is not going anywhere. It's this bird. Uh, Charlie Parker's still the GOAT, man. He's he's still the GOAT. He's got everybody between him and Coltrane. And Coltrane, there's a picture of Coltrane. I don't know if you ever saw this picture. Charlie Parker's playing. It's a big band, right? Somebody's big band. Bird is in the mic, and Coltrane is sitting up in front, right? He's on the edge of his seat like this here. He's got a cigarette in his hand, and the ash is about 2 inches long, getting ready to fall. He's just totally mesmerized. And he said, like, I can't believe what this guy's doing, man. He's getting ready to burn his finger, man.
Oh, that's a great image.
Yeah, it is. If the pic, I gotta find that picture, man. I mean, his mouth is open. He's like that, like
Let me see if I
so.
can put this into a question. Amongst your things you've written or people writing about you,
uh,
talk about music as a spiritual force and connecting to your African ancestry.
yes.
I have a couple questions. First of all, was this um, urge to do that, was it a family thing? Were your parents and your grandparents interested in their ancestry, or was this something you found on your own?
Um, that's an interesting question because there's a lot of stuff in there. My mom was very much the educator, and she was a librarian, and she was somebody who had to drop out of high school as a teenager because she was ill. She had rheumatic heart and some other, so she couldn't finish high school. Then she got married, and there were five of us. But she used to always say, she got married at 17, I think, and she had five kids. I'm the second oldest. And she used to always tell us, uh, you got to do good in school because as soon as uh, you guys get up to some age or some size, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to finish my education. So we said, okay, mom. So don't bring no bad report cards in here. So we had to do good in school, right? When my baby sister was about to graduate from high school and go on to college, mom went back to school and she got her. At that time, they didn't have. They had what they call high school equivalency. Now they call it something else. I forget what they call it. But
GED or something like that.
yeah, GED. Before GED, they had what they call high school equivalency. She got that, and then there was this program, college program called Seek, which was a state program. She got in that. She got a bachelor's, in education. And we said, okay, mom proved the point. Next thing we know, she's in grad school. She went, she wound up with a master's in library science, and wound up working for the Erie County Library System until she was about, her health prevented her from working past, I think, 64, 65. But while she was a librarian, But she did a lot of stuff for history. For instance, she's the one who started Martin Luther King Day for before it was a national holiday. She started a program in her little library. She called me up and said, "Listen, I think it's a shame that every January comes and nobody, because she was a big birthday. She celebrated everybody's birthday. She said, I think it's bad that January 15th comes around and nobody says anything about Dr. King. So I'm going to have a little program here in the library. You come down, bring the boys in the band. I'm going to cook some chicken wings." And so we started doing that. And every year it got bigger and bigger. And now it's in I think it's in Klein Hans Music Hall now. It's this huge thing. And she was very much interested in the Underground Railroad and stuff like that. She was from Georgia and remembers coming up to Buffalo on the segregated train with her mom when she was about 6. So yeah, it was kind of DNA, it was kind of in the blood. But as far as me personally, coming up, I loved the music, but I thought it was tragic how many of our great musicians like Bird and like Lee Morgan and Hank Mobley and uh, you know, so many others, man, Bud Powell. They had tragic life circumstances, and a lot of times Fats Waller, and they died young, and a lot of it had to do with their lifestyles, um, it had to do with alcohol, it had to do with drugs. Billie Holiday, Bessie Smith, so many sad stories. But then I noticed that there was another group of musicians who seemed to not have those specific problems, and they were the ones who were more spiritually oriented. They were most of them, you know, most of them were Muslim, but they could be like Benny Golson was a Jehovah Witness, I think,
And
from what I've
Dizzy,
heard. Huh?
and Dizzy.
It, Dizzy was Baha'i,
Yeah.
but when I did a research project one time on Islam and about bebop musicians, and what I heard from a couple of those guys is that they used to all hang out in a certain mosque in Harlem. Monk, Rollins, even the ones who weren't, a lot of them became Muslim outwardly and changed their names, like Yusuf Lateef, Ahmad Jamal, Sadiq Hakim, the piano player. But then there were others people didn't know, like McCoy Tyner was Muslim, Art Blakey, Dakota Staten, Lynn Hope, great saxophone player, even Kenny Clark. Kenny Clark, when his book, his autobiography came out, it had Kenny Clark and then his Muslim name underneath it. I think it was Ali, something like that. Um, and they tend to have a better, grip on life. A lot of times they had families and they kind of avoid the pitfalls. And so with me coming from a pretty much traditional home, going to church at least once or twice a week, having, ministers in the family and whatnot. Otherwise I could have been, turned it back, say, no, no, man, if you become a musician, you got to use drugs or you got to be an alcoholic. It seemed if that's the norm, but there was this other group, that wasn't about that. So that was even when John Coltrane Quartet came to the Royal Arms in Buffalo when I was in high school, and John at that time was, uh, he was clean, but his years of abuse had pretty much did his liver in, and he only had a couple more years to live. But Jimmy Garrison and Elvin Jones, were obviously intoxicated, and McCoy Tyner would just sit over by himself, sipping on water or soda pop or something like that. And sometimes Yusuf Lateef, when he came here, because I used to watch these guys, Yusuf Lateef would come. Sometimes he wouldn't even leave the bandstand on a break. They'd bring him coffee or whatever. He wouldn't even leave the bandstand. He just wouldn't. I'm not even going down there. So I said, yeah, I related to that. Um, I met Yusuf Lateef one time when I was a serviceman in Germany. I used to on my break sometimes I would just go to different cities and visit. I went to Hamburg one time and Yusuf was playing in Hamburg, and I got a chance to sit and talk with him for a long time. And He told me about how, his spirituality, how his religious, how his faith that, kept him away from certain things that destroyed other musicians. And he actually gave me some books to read, you know. So, so yeah, that was a big. It's interesting you should ask because I just recently I saw an interview like this one. Alice Coltrane did an interview with Bradford Marcellus. Have you seen that one?
No.
Yeah, look it up. It's online. It just came out, I think. It's really interesting where he asked her about it. And Alice is very spiritual, very much into the culture. And so is John, of course. Obviously everybody knows. But I think Alice had some influence on him, or it was probably mutual. Uh, that the music is more than just music. In fact, in my memoir, which I hope to finish up hopefully by next year, I call it "It's More Than Only Music." More than only music. And that music is a connection. It's connection to the past. Musicians um, are like re recorders. We're like recorders or reporters of what's going on in society, what's going on, and at the time, and especially in the African American experience, music was one of the few things that we were allowed to, preserve stuff in because we weren't supposed to read or write or, do any of the literary things. And so if we do a careful analysis of the musical history with whether it be blues, whether it be folk, or gospel or church music or whatnot, we can get a good idea of what was going on in terms of civil rights, in terms of human rights, human suffering and degradation. You can hear the cries, in the music. And
You made
so
me
that's why I really think that I think that the Lord Almighty gave us the blues, which seems to it's not going to ever go away, and it has many forms, I mean, almost all American music forms have some form of blues connection, whether it be jazz, country, rap, whatever they call it, the blues is just there.
you made me think of Joe Williams performed here, and he introduced one song, and
Mm.
he said, "Blues frees the spirit."
Yeah, yeah, it does, it does, and it really comes out of the old spirituals, where people were singing, and hopes of and prayers for a better day, better conditions. Uh, I saw a heart-wrenching interview. But I mean, sometimes stuff just pops up on YouTube, and I say, "Oh, I just got to hear this." Something popped up the other day. Somebody interviewed Nina Simone, after she had left the States and went to France, I think, when she came back, and they were interviewing her, and they asked her, uh, "Why'd you leave?" And she says, I left because I didn't like this country. I didn't like the way they were treating me. I didn't like the way they were treating my people. And I came back because I thought things might be different, uh, and it's just she just really bared her soul in this interview. Went on and on and on. I had to stop watching it. I'll get back to it, man, because just she the story she's telling is like so many other musicians who went overseas, and then having lived overseas, I had a chance to. I know when I was in Berlin one time, I ran into Carmel Jones and Leo Wright, and they were saying, "Oh no, we ain't never going back there, man. No, we like it just fine here. Berlin is all right." When I toured Italy with Abby Lincoln, which that was an amazing band because Mel Waldron was a piano player, you know, and Mel and I got pretty tight, because he found out I could play chess, and he loved to play chess, So in addition to the music, if we weren't playing music, we were playing chess. And so he said the same thing. No, no, I'm not going back there, man. Mm-mm. And Art Farmer had lived overseas for a while. Idris Muhammad, and even the old guys, Louis Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins, you know, uh, because things are just different. Musicians and artists are given another level of respect. You don't make a ton of money, but you get treated like somebody special, which is something I think all artists need to do to encourage them to continue in their art.
I want to
So,
ask you about a video I saw. um, was a sextet, I think, of you at the Buffalo History Museum. I believe you were playing a composition called Joy. Does that ring a bell?
Joy at the Buffalo History Museum.
Yeah.
Oh no. You know what? The lady who recorded it, her name was Joy.
Okay. I thought that
Yeah,
might be something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
But
That's
there was
yeah,
a fellow in a curved soprano and a trumpet. And um,
yeah.
so I have a couple observations, and you had a sort of a lengthy bass intro to the tune.
Hmm.
And two people came to mind while you were playing. One was Henry Grimes, and the other
Yeah,
was Buster Williams.
yeah. Two of my guys. Yeah, two of my guys. Uh, Buster Williams and I go back to the 70s. You know, when he was playing with Herbie and Mwandishi, and those guys used to come to Buffalo, and we kind of we met each other, you know, and I never got a chance to really collaborate with him, but I always admired his great bass player. Henry Grimes, I actually got a chance to play with. He came to Buffalo a couple years before he passed, and he came to the club, and he was playing. He wanted to play, you know, he played violin too.
Yes.
So he wanted to play violin. He asked me to play bass, and so there's a couple pictures that were of us playing together, you know. But no, bass players, you know, they're in my soul, you know. Richard Davis was my coming up. Richard Davis and Paul Chambers were my main guys, you know.
Mhm.
And then of course I got a chance to study with Ron Carter, you know, and my you know my famous what I'm most known for is the time I spent with Charles Mingus, you know. Which funny thing about that though, it wasn't with Mingus, it was more about composition than bass playing, you know. I played bass with him. Uh, that's the way he taught. He's composition class at the university. Uh, he just come in, he give me the music. He sit down and he played a tune on the piano, and I follow along. And then I wound up playing in his band for one night. So I guess he figured I had learned the music pretty good, you know. And uh, when the book came out, Beneath the Underdog, the publisher wanted to have a book release party, and they wanted the band to play, but they also wanted him to be around to autograph books and talk to people. And so he brings me down from Buffalo to play with the Charles Mingus Sextet. And he didn't ask me that I wanted, could I was I available or would I like to do it. He just tells me at the end of one class, "Oh, you got to call Sue because she made your arrangements." I said, "For what?" She said, "You coming to New York on so and so day. I didn't tell you." I said, "No, you did that." I said, "For what?" She, "Well, you got to play with my band." I said, "Come on, Charles. You got me stand in your footsteps and play your bass and whatnot." And so it happened, you know. And I was 24 years old at the time, you
Oh, man.
know.
Did
Yeah.
any of his he would stand up for himself, is one way to put it. He didn't suffer
Mhm.
fools gladly. Did did you learn and observe that behavior and say this could be part of the way I need to operate on occasion?
Absolutely. See, when we were coming up in the 60s, especially when I was in high school, as young artists, as young black men, we were really, uh, there was a lot going on, you know. I mean, a lot of assassinations were going on. There was a lot of protests and a lot of stuff was happening. And so uh, we were looking for the right role models you know, we wanted to be a part of this, you know. And so we had people, Mingus was one of our main guys because he was a rebel, you know, he wasn't, you know, he wasn't just accepting the status quo, you know, he was demanding his rights, and you know, he was fussing with the industry, and he made us aware of the fact of the injustice of the business aspect of music. And music is, like I said, it's more than only music. That music is also business. Music is also a claim to dignity and a claim to some things that really traditionally had been denied. And if you were coming up in this experience, if you weren't an athlete or some kind of an artist or somebody who could do something special, then you might not. you might be suffering all your life, And so Mingus broke with that. And I remember one time we had an after school, um, this is long before I thought I might play bass. We had an after school club in high school, a jazz club, where we would bring, we had a trumpet player. He was a biology teacher, but he also was a pretty good trumpet player, Italian guy named Sam Mollet. And he organized this jazz club because he saw us walking around with our albums and he knew we loved music. He said, "Why don't you guys come to my, classroom, the science lab?" They had the big black, thing in front with the faucet. And that was for the lab. And so he would set up a turntable, or that time you had the record players that the speaker was in the top. You just flip it off, and we'd bring records in and play them, and then we would discuss and analyze the music. And so one time somebody brought in Mingus Dynasty, and I mean, before we played the music, we had a big discussion about the cover because Charles was on there with all this Chinese regalia on and stuff. And one guy said, "Man, who's this guy think he is, man?" Somebody else said, "That's who he thinks he is, just the way he's dressed. So we that's where I got the idea. Well, yeah, how you present yourself in terms of how you dress on stage and whatnot, it sends a big message out. And then Rufus Harley used to come to Buffalo. You ever heard of Rufus Harley?
Oh, the bagpipe player?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Rufus would come to town and he'd come on. I mean, he'd come on stage with a whole kilt, the Scottish kilt, and the whole everything, like a Scotsman. And he gave a long history about Africans in Scotland and how bagpipe is originally our instrument. I remember he made one record he made called Bagpipe Blues. So we have people like this, that will, of course, Monk is doing it only the way he could do it. He always had a hat on or a kufi, something covering his head, and then he's dancing around the music and the
Yeah.
stage, and he's showing you freedom of expression. Is what we learned from these guys, that you can in this music you can be free as you want to be or as you need to be. You don't have to conform because your music and your art and the gift, your God-given gift is enough to qualify you to make a statement that you think needs to be made. And so Mingus, even long before, I had no idea that one day I would be called his protege or be associated with him or play in the band. His band, I mean, this is, if you told me that in high school, I would tell you, no way, you crazy, man. But this stuff happened to me. And I'm just thankful. And a lot of my students asked, he said, "Well, how'd you do all that stuff? I said a lot of it is just being in the right place at the right time. You can't plan it. That's why hang time among musicians, as you know, hang time is just as important as playing time. Sometimes you gotta be, you know, you got to just be there to be noticed. I was playing in San Francisco one time at the Keystone Corner with Ahmad again, and on the break, Stan Getz comes up to me, man, and he says, "Oh, hey, man." And what I love about musicians that they always the camaraderie. They come up and they have known you all your life. I never Stan Getz before, so he comes up to me and he says, "Hey, Sabu." I said, "Yeah, man." He said, "Hey, man, let me ask you a question." I said, "Yeah, what?" He said, "How do you keep up with that guy?" He's all over the place. And he knows that a lot of stuff we're doing is not rehearsed. It's just intuitive. He says, "How do you do that?" I told him, I said, "Stan, I just learned how to listen well." And he
Who
says,
is
"Well,
he
I like that."
who
Huh?
is he referring to? How do you keep up?
Stan Getz.
Oh,
He's talking about Ahmad. Stan
you're
Getz
talking
asked me.
about, yeah,
I was
okay.
playing with Ahmad Jamal. Yeah. And of course, in Keystone Corner in those days, that was the spot. The audience is full, just like the Vanguard and Sweet Bay, the places in New York. The audience is mainly musicians. I mean, not just. I mean, there you got Stan Getz here. There's Joe Henderson's over there. Woody Shaw's in the building. Margaret Miller's over there. You know, and there's just all these great musicians, man. They look at you, looking at you, they're looking at you like, "Yeah, what are you gonna do?" Uh, so, but like I say, being in certain places and certain venues will get you opportunities that you might not get if you just stayed home or you just went to your own gigs and then you don't socialize with the musicians, you don't hang out.
Yeah.
Well,
If I go
but
back
thanks,
to
so
that,
thanks. Yeah, that was. I think that was my composition. I was playing Oasis for Jalila, uh, where I took an extended solo in the front of it. Yeah.
yes, and it made me wonder what you hope listeners get from your music. I don't know if I could have phrased that in a better way, but do you hope
Yeah.
that I think you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think my answer would be similar to what John Coltrane was asked a similar question one time, and I loved his answer. He said, he said, I hope to make people realize that we live in a big, beautiful universe. We're only a tiny part of a beautiful universe, and that I will hope that my listeners, realize that there is meaning to life. Life has meaning, and certainly life does have meaning, and that this meaning can be expressed through music. And something like that, he said, and I always thought that that was really uh, short but very appropriate answer to it. That music is a reflection of life, and life has a very deep meaning. We should never take it, for granted. And that the musician, especially the spiritually attuned musician, is always trying to connect. Like Albert Ellis said, music is the healing force of the universe. I love that quote from him too. And that the musicians that I love the most are the ones that are not afraid, to stretch the boundaries and even break the rules. Like I tell students all the time, you have to learn the rules so you know how to break them. You know?
It's a good one.
Yeah.
I've heard people say and write about free jazz because you remember you mentioned Albert Eiler.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of times it seems like why are these musicians so angry? And I once asked Rashid Ali about that, and he said it was more about just a reflection of the times.
Mhm.
I wonder if you have a thought about that.
Yeah, I think anger is a misinterpretation. Yeah, we like one time they asked Archie Shepp, was he angry? This was back in the heyday when Archie was pretty big in the 60s. And I said, why are musicians are you guys angry? He said, no, we're not angry, we're enraged. You know, we're enraged about the conditions, about the history, about the way we've been treated, about um, Dexter Gordon talks about in his biography, he talks about how when he was in the army, right, a lieutenant or maybe a sergeant or somebody, a superior officer came in to his space, right, and he had a picture of his wife there on the dresser or by the bed where, and the guy said something. He didn't say exactly what he said, but he said something disrespectful because the wife was lighter skinned, very beautiful. And he asked him, "Is that who's that?" He said, "That's my wife." And he said something that Dexter didn't like, and so he decked him,
You
you
what?
know. And so he decked him. He hit him.
Oh,
He hit him, punched him out. And Dexter's about 6'7", big guy. Anyway, so he hit this guy because he said something about his wife or her complexion or something like, "What are you doing with a white woman?" Something like that. And so he hit the guy, and then he wound up going to jail, to the brig, what they call in the army. And then stayed there for he had a bad, like Lester Young, he had a bad military experience. They said Lester was never the same after he came out of the army, that, and you can hear it in the records the way he was playing with Count Basie and whatnot before he got drafted. And his records afterward, they were still good, but they weren't on the same level. But Dexter went through that, and what he said in terms of anger, he said that it seems to him that America should be grateful, especially to the bebop musicians, most of whom were veterans of the world. With he said the veteran seems like the veterans of World War II, actually the ones who created bebop, you know, and a lot of them were vets, including Al Tinney, Dexter, Elvin Jones. A lot of times they didn't make a big deal about it. You might not have known it, but they actually went and, you know, put their lives on the line for this country and then come back and be treated in such a way. It's upsetting. But when it comes to artists, I think more so than anger, it's about um, expressing a desire or a need or a real, a real belief that that things can be better, that we can be better. But we all have to do something. We can't sit back and just tisk tisk it, just say, "Oh, too bad." But we have to all be active participants in trying to make things better. And so when, a lot of people were upset when John Coltrane kind of went into outer space toward the end, playing, breaking the rules and playing against tradition and playing different, even Miles did it a different way. But I think all of the artists, they were trying to say to us that, we can't be stagnant. We can't be complacent, that we have to keep moving the boundaries. We have to keep, expanding our horizons. That's our job as artists. If we're not doing that, and most of the artists, even European artists, like Picasso, Michelangelo, uh, all great artists, they were all involved in trying to expand the boundaries, and get people to see things in another way, hopefully a better way.
Well said. And all the more important in these particular times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we're seeing a retrograde. We're seeing a retrogression now. We've seen a lot of people now talking about just throwing up their hands and moving to another country, because things are that bad. Things are, you got people trying to remake this whole democratic experience, in their own image, which is not progressive, it's degressive. It seems like they want to go back to a time in history which, most Americans are embarrassed about. Most Americans are, uh, wish that we never had slavery, wish that we never had, that it didn't take, centuries for women even to be able to get to vote, and that they shouldn't have, most of us, if we could go back and rewrite history, we try to write it in the true image of what the democratic ideal says it's supposed to be, which is freedom, justice, and equality for all, equal opportunities. And we know that that has not been the case. And but it also shows us the benefit of organization. These people now that are, so well organized, so taking over, taking us back, they're well organized, well organized. And musicians have realized a long time ago. Like I remember one time, the in Chicago, what's the name of the group?
The AACM, AC,
AACM, Joseph,
yeah,
yeah, AACM, and what's the trumpet player who used to wear the doctor's coat all the time?
Lester Bowie.
Lester Boyd. Lester Boyd was interviewed one time, and he said, "Yeah, man, we realized, we reached the point where we realized that, man, if we're gonna get respect for our music, and we're gonna have to organize this. We're gonna have to do this ourselves, because nobody's gonna do it for us, And that's
Yes.
when they started the AACO.
Well,
So
this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we had the opportunity. I want to thank you for your time and your how well you speak about your music and everything that goes with it.
I apologize for I go on and on sometimes, but as you can see, I probably need to publish my books because as you can see, I have a lot to say about it. I've got deep feelings about it. It's been basically a love affair, and tell you another funny story before I know we got a time element, but when my mother first came to me and said she wanted me to take music lessons, I was against it. I was about 7, 8, something like that, and I didn't want to take music lessons. I didn't want to take piano lessons. And she said, why not? And I said, because the music is for girls. And she said, why would you say that? I said, because all the musicians I see, like in church, they were my aunts and my cousins, but they were all girls. She said, no, the best musicians in the world are men. And I was like, where are they? I ain't never seen none. So one day I was out in the yard playing, and my sister came, my older sister came and said, Mama says, come in right now. Come quick, come. And so she grabbed me by me and grabbed me in the living room. She said, look, my mom says, look, there's a TV on, There's Louis Armstrong, you know. Louis Armstrong, man, with his trumpet, one hand, and hanky in the other hand. He's clean, he's got a tuxedo on. She said, he's the best in the world. There you go. He's the best. I said, oh, really? And so that changed my thinking. And then, of course, then I wanted the trumpet. So anyway, that's part of my metamorphosis. Yeah.
It's terrific.
Yeah.
I've had a couple, I didn't know the word, but now I do, epiphanies myself like that. So
Epiphany. Yeah. 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 That was, and I, and and she was, I don't know how she knew it, but she knew back then in the 50s. She said, he's the best musician in the whole world, you know. And now, uh, over 100 years after his birth, or 50 or so years after his death, I pretty much everybody agrees. Yep, he's the guy. He's
yeah.
Louis is nobody. Like Miles said one time. He said, "There's nothing we can play that Louis hasn't played already."
Yes.
I mean, I'm like, wow.
And those hot
He
five
played
and
him.
those hot five and hot seven records were recorded like 100 years ago.
Yeah,
Was this?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's why, Monk. That's why we know that this thing is not just it's a divine. It's divinely revealed. It's not really from us. It's something otherworldly. Like Art Blakey said, it's the music is a gift. It's from the creator to the artist to the audience in split second time. What he said, split second timing.
Yeah.
He said, and that's something that it's unrehearsed, it's unplanned. We don't know. You know, was it Sonny Rollins or Coltrane? One time, somebody came backstage and showed him some music and said, "What do you think about this?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, it looks interesting, but it's just too difficult. I never could play it." And they told Coltrane, he said, "No, this is your solo on Blue Train." He said, "I played that." Yeah, there you go.
Wonderful.
Somebody transcribed the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
All
thanks so
right.
much. I
Thanks
really
for your
appreciate
time.
it.
I'll pause our recording and then we'll say our goodbyes.
Okay,
Appreciate it.
absolutely. Thank you.